Kellington is a small village, bounded to the north by the river Aire, and to the south by the A645 and the M62. To the east is the A19, and to the west is Nottingley and the A1. It's surrounded by farmland, mainly arable. Marsh Dyke divides the farmland to the north of the village from Ings Lane. These fields stretch about a quarter of a mile to the River Aire and are officially washland. This means that they flood most winters, and sometimes at other times of year as well. Combined with a high reinforced riverbank, these washlands have usually, but not always, been sufficient to protect the village from flooding. Until this year, the last serious flood was in 1947, when the waters reached up as far as Marigold Terrace, almost up to the Red Lion pub. Marsh Lane leads south from the river and joins Ings Lane, which is horseshoe-shaped. Ings Lane itself leads south to Kellington Crossroads and the Red Lion pub. The white houses you see on the left are Marigold Terrace. Ings Lane then joins Low Road and Eastfield Lane at the crossroads. This year, all property to the north of these roads was threatened by flooding. So what changed? Well, the village is just 2 miles from Kellington Colliery. In the early 1990s, mining took place under the village, and the resulting subsidence has meant that the washland is no longer sufficient to protect the village from flooding. RJB and the Environment Agency plan to construct a flood bank running behind the houses in Ings Lane. The flood bank runs from Roll Lane, which is the eastern extension of Eastfield Lane, right round the northern part of the village, ending just to the west of Marsh Lane. From the very beginning, it was unpopular with some of the residents living in the adjacent houses. Quite apart from the fact that it blocked their view, it was an extremely messy and noisy operation and took a long time to complete. Work began in 1995. One of the first important tasks was to move Marsh Dyke. In its original position, it formed the boundary between the fields and the gardens of the houses in Ings Lane. Its new position was several metres further north, on the other side of the flood bank. While this diversion was taking place, a temporary road was constructed to allow farm vehicles access to the fields further north. Work continued through the autumn of 1995, both in constructing the new flood bank and in diverting the dyke. Hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of expensive machinery was busy working throughout all the daylight hours. Much to the residents' great relief, when it came to the worst of the winter months, the vehicles were parked up. The criminal fraternity must have been very pleased as well, because during those winter months they moved in and stole the vehicle. In the spring of 1996, work on the flood bank resumed. Marsh Dyke had been one of the most important drains for the surface water running off from the village. Now that Marsh Dyke had been moved, a drainage system had to be installed to feed this surface water through the new flood bank and into Marsh Dyke at the other side. A valve was positioned which would allow the surface water to be drained through the flood bank to Marsh Dyke, but would not allow floodwater from Marsh Dyke to seep back through the flood bank. This then was the new flood bank. September and October in the year 2000 were exceptionally wet, and nobody was very surprised or very worried when the river overflowed. After all, it does every year. However, this time it didn't stop. Usually it overflows for perhaps 24 hours, and then we get a fine spell and the floods go away. But this year the rain kept coming, and the water kept cascading over the riverbank. The floodwater rose higher and higher against the new floodbank, and eventually sandbags had to be placed to keep the water out. What appears to be a sea of mud is in fact the stubble which has been washed out of the fields, floating on the tide of floodwater. Many people use this green box, standing beside an electricity pole, to judge how high the water level was. The river at Kellington is tidal to some extent, and as you can see, sometimes the box is there, and sometimes it's just about disappeared. By Thursday, the 2nd of November, the situation was becoming very frightening. It had been raining steadily all day. The Environment Agency had men stationed on the floodbank monitoring the situation, and a high tide was expected in the early hours of Friday morning. The surface water, meanwhile, was backing up closer and closer to the houses in Ings Lane. Late on Thursday afternoon, a fire engine from Drax Power Station turned up to pump the water back into the washland. At this stage, with the water rising rapidly on both sides of the floodbank, it seemed inevitable that the river would overtop. By 8:30 that evening, the residents living adjacent to the floodbank were frantically trying to move all their possessions upstairs or to another place of safety. By 11:30 that night, and again at 3 o'clock on the morning of Wednesday the 8th of November, residents living north of Eastfield Lane, Rowell Lane and Low Lane were advised to evacuate their houses. In the event, with the aid of a lot of sandbags and good luck, the floodbank held. Surface water continued to be a problem, as there was nowhere for it to drain off naturally. One of the local farmers, Guy Poskett, installed his irrigation pump to help drain the surface water from behind Ings Lane. Main Street, which leads south and slightly uphill from Kellington Crossroads, also experienced flooding. At the top there had once been an old lake which had been filled in, and surface water gathered there. The section of road near the village green was under 2 feet of water and was closed as it was impassable by normal cars, and sandbagging took place in the property all around. The nearest point where you could see the river was at Beale Bridge, and here it was truly spectacular, water as far as you could see in either direction. As a vantage point, naturally it attracted a great deal of attention, including the media. Even Yorkshire television had turned up with a suitably wet camera crew, and still the rain came down relentlessly, and the water poured over the riverbanks. By Friday, the 10th of November, the Environment Agency had hired 3 enormous pumps. They came from Holland and were bigger than anything available in England. Each one was 7 metres long, 3 metres high and 2 metres wide, and capable of pumping out 2 tons of water per second. The cost of hiring these was £150,000 a month. One of these giant pumps began work at Chapel Haddlesey. As the washland was drained, a digger would move in and dig channels to guide the water towards the pump. By the following Wednesday, a substantial amount of the washland had been drained. The combination of so much standing water and the nearby power station also gave us our first fog of the winter that day. This pump continued to work at Chapel Haddlesey until Tuesday the 21st of November. It was certainly a very effective piece of equipment. I understand that they have now installed at Gowdle even bigger pumps capable of shifting 5 tons per second. If this is 2 tons per second, I wonder what 5 tons looks like. Looking across the washland at Kellington, you can see that a great deal of water has already gone down. At its highest, the floodwater covered an area roughly the size of Lake Windermere. However, looking towards Beal, you can see that there's still a great deal to go. In the eventuality, no houses in Kellington were actually flooded. But when you go and stand on the floodbank, look at how high the sandbag piles are, you realise how close we were. Was the floodbank necessary? Well, I think the obvious answer to that is yes. Even if we hadn't been mined under, even if there'd been no subsidence, I think that this year the village would have been flooded if the floodbank hadn't been built. As you walk along Ings Lane and Bird Lane, you notice the sandbags are still there. Yes, the floodwaters have receded, but we're not giving up our sandbags yet, not until the end of the winter at least.